In 2008, a team of scientists pointed a ground-penetrating radar at the Earth near the base of an Egyptian pyramid and found a structure the size of a small city beneath the sand. Not a single room, a massive grid of walls and corridors at a depth of 26 to 40 feet, covering several acres. Walls several meters thick, made of a material with the electrical resistance of granite. Geometrically precise rectangular structures that nature does not produce. This was exactly what Herodotus had described 2,500 years ago. A building 1,000 feet long and 800 feet wide, large enough to fit the temples of Karnak and Luxor inside simultaneously, with 3,000 rooms, corridors you couldn't navigate without a guide, and underground halls that Herodotus was not permitted to enter at all. He wrote that this building surpassed even the pyramids. Then it disappeared. In the 19th century, Flinders Petrie excavated the site, found a stone slab, and declared, "The labyrinth is gone, quarried for building material in antiquity." Science agreed. For 120 years, nobody looked any deeper. It turned out Petrie had been looking at the roof. The building itself lay below, untouched. The Madaha expedition team published their scanning results. Egyptian authorities immediately banned their circulation. 15 years have passed. No excavation has begun. The labyrinth lies underground and is slowly being destroyed by saltwater rising from below. Why is Egypt blocking the study of one of the largest ancient monuments in the world? What did the radar show? And why was it considered sensitive enough to suppress? And if an untouched building that Herodotus considered more magnificent than the pyramids is still lying beneath the Egyptian sand, what does that tell us about how much we still don't know about a civilization we think we've studied inside and out? To answer that, we need to start with a pharaoh whose name barely appears in any textbook, even though he appears to have built the most complex structure in all of Egyptian history. Amenemhet III ruled Egypt from roughly 1860 to 1814 BCE, nearly half a century, which by the standards of Egyptian pharaohs counts as a long and successful reign. He was the last great ruler of the 12th dynasty, a period Egyptologists call the peak of the Middle Kingdom. Under him, Egypt reached its height of administrative complexity and building activity, and under him was constructed a building that 2,500 years later would make Herodotus forget about the pyramids, but in popular memory, Amenemhet III is almost entirely absent. Ask anyone, and they'll name Tutankhamun, Ramesses, Nefertiti. Amenemhet III didn't make that list for a simple reason. His tomb wasn't found at the right time, his mummy didn't become a sensation. History remembers those whose artifacts reached the right hands at the right moment. Amenemhet III was unlucky in that regard, but he was lucky enough to build something that outlasted everyone else. He built twice. His first pyramid, at Dashur, the so-called Black Pyramid, he began at the start of his reign. But groundwater seeped into the burial chambers, the foundation began to crack, and the pharaoh made a decision rare even by Egyptian standards. He abandoned the pyramid unfinished and started a new one. The second pyramid was Hawara, in the Fayum oasis, roughly 60 miles south of Cairo. It was here that he built what the Greeks would later call the Labyrinth. Why a building of this scale was needed is a question Egyptologists still haven't answered definitively. The official explanation? A mortuary temple, intended for rituals honoring the dead pharaoh. But mortuary temples were built at every pyramid, and none of them came anywhere close to comparable size. The mortuary temple at the Pyramid of Khafre at Giza covers roughly 10,000 square feet. Amenemhet III's labyrinth, 300,000, 28 times larger. Strabo, who visited Egypt in the 1st century BCE, wrote that the labyrinth had as many halls as Egypt had provinces, 42, and each was dedicated to the gods of the corresponding province. This description suggests not simply a mortuary temple, but an administrative and religious center for the entire state, a place where the threads of running the country converged. Amenemhet III was deified during his own lifetime, rare even for Egypt. In the Fayum oasis, he was worshipped as a god of water and fertility under the name Primaris, as late as the Roman era, 1,500 years after his death. What exactly took place inside those 3,000 rooms? What rituals? What archives? What knowledge was kept there? We don't know. Herodotus saw the upper floor and was astounded. He was not permitted to enter the lower level. And that was whatever lay below remains the central mystery of the labyrinth to this day. Herodotus came to the labyrinth around 450 BCE, 1,500 years after Amenemhet III built it. The building was already ancient when the Greek crossed its threshold, and yet it stood, intact, functioning. Egyptian priests led visitors through the upper halls with the same confidence as tour guides do today. What he recorded after his visit became the most detailed description of any that has survived to us. In the second book of his histories, Herodotus wrote that the labyrinth surpassed even the pyramids, and that if all the walls and structures of Greece were gathered together, they would have required less labor than this one building. A man who had traveled the entire known ancient world and seen the pyramids at Giza, writing that he had seen something grander. He described 12 main courtyards, hall after hall, rooms opening into galleries, galleries leading back into rooms, until the traveler was completely lost. Herodotus himself admitted he got turned around and had to be let out by the priests. He saw the upper floor in full. He was not allowed near the lower one. Down there lie the bodies of the pharaohs and the sacred crocodiles, they explained, and it is forbidden for foreigners to enter. Strabo visited Egypt around 25 BCE, already under Roman rule, and found the building partially damaged. But even in that state, it made an impression. He counted 42 halls, matching the number of Egypt's provinces, and wrote that each was dedicated to the gods of its region. By his account, the labyrinth looked like a stone encyclopedia of the Egyptian state, where every part of the country had its representation and its shrine. Diodorus Siculus added a detail that connected the Egyptian labyrinth to Greek mythology. It was this very building that inspired Daedalus to create the Cretan labyrinth, the one where the Minotaur lived. Daedalus, apparently, managed to reproduce only 1/100th of its complexity. Pliny the Elder mentioned columns of Parian marble and doors of monolithic stone weighing several tons each. 6 authors, Herodotus, Strabo, Manetho, Diodorus Siculus, Pliny the Elder, and Pomponius Mela, in different eras, from the 5th century BCE to the 1st century CE, described the same building or its remains. All were astonished. None was exaggerating in a vacuum. Each was drawing on what they had personally seen. This is not a legend passed down through generations. These are independent eyewitness accounts of a real structure. And yet by the 19th century, nothing remained of it but a stone slab in the sand. How did a building of that scale disappear so completely, and who exactly destroyed it? In 1888, British archaeologist William Flinders Petrie arrived at Hawara with a specific goal. He wanted to find the Labyrinth of Herodotus, the building 6 ancient authors had written about, which no one had seen in several centuries. Petrie was not a romantic amateur, but a methodical scholar who laid the foundations of modern field archaeology. If anyone could find the labyrinth, it was him. What he discovered initially looked like success. To the south of Amenemhat, the Third's pyramid, Petrie came upon a massive artificial stone platform, 1,000 feet long and 800 feet wide. The dimensions matched the ancient author's descriptions almost perfectly. Petrie was convinced he had found what he was looking for, but the longer he dug, the clearer a picture emerged that gave him no pleasure. On top of the stone slab lay a layer of building debris, broken stone, column fragments, pieces of statues. Petrie reached a conclusion that seemed logical. The labyrinth had been demolished to the foundations. Someone had methodically dismantled it stone by stone and used the material to build elsewhere. The evidence suggested this happened during the Ptolemaic period, when old Egyptian structures were routinely stripped for building material for new cities. Petrie recorded his findings, published his report, and closed the case. The labyrinth is destroyed, only the foundation remains. Science accepted this conclusion and lost interest in Hawara for 120 years. But Petrie's conclusion had one problem that nobody noticed at first. It assumed that the stone slab was the floor of the labyrinth, its foundation, that the building had stood on top of it, been destroyed, and only this stone surface remained. This seemed obvious. So obvious that nobody asked the next question. What if the slab isn't the floor? What if it's the ceiling? Petrie himself had indirectly given the clue without realizing it. In his reports, he described the stone slab as unusually thick and monolithic, not the kind Egyptian building foundations typically were. Foundations were made from smaller blocks, ceilings and roof structures, from large monolithic slabs capable of bearing the weight of earth above them. The slab at Hawara was exactly that. Petrie was holding the key to the answer and didn't understand he had it. Petrie left Hawara with a different sensation entirely. Among the burials to the north of the pyramid, he had discovered the Fayum portraits, a series of realistic painted portraits on wooden panels placed over mummies from the Greco-Roman period. Among the very few surviving painted portraits from classical antiquity, the labyrinth faded into the background and stayed there for the next 120 years, until one person decided to check what exactly lay beneath that stone slab. Louis de Cordier, a Belgian artist and researcher, first became interested in the Egyptian labyrinth in the early 2000s. Not an archaeologist, not an Egyptologist, a man seized by the idea that one of the greatest structures of the ancient world lay untouched beneath the ground, and that nobody had checked this with modern technology. De Cordier did what professional scholars had somehow not done in the 120 years since Petrie. He reread Petrie's reports carefully and noticed an inconsistency. Petrie described the stone slab as unusually thick and monolithic. For a foundation, that's atypical. For a ceiling bearing the weight of earth above it, entirely logical. If the slab was a roof and not a floor, then the building was not above it, but below it. And Petrie, stopping at the level of the slab, had simply never reached the labyrinth. In 2008, de Cordier organized the Madaha expedition, a joint project with Egypt's National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics under Dr. Abbas Mohammed Abbas and Ghent University in Belgium. Instead of shovels, ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and low-frequency electromagnetic scanning. Technologies that allow you to see through the earth without a single blow to the surface. The results came quickly. Beneath the stone slab, at a depth of 26 to 40 feet, the instruments detected an enormous, geometrically precise grid of vertical walls, forming rectangular chambers. Walls several meters thick made of material with an electrical resistance characteristic of granite. The structure covered several acres to the south of the pyramid, exactly where the ancient authors placed the labyrinth. The NRIAG report, published in the fall of 2008, described a grid-like structure of enormous size made of material with very high resistance, forming practically enclosed chambers. This is not a geological anomaly. Nature does not produce geometrically precise rectangular grids 30 feet underground. Petrie was wrong not because he was a poor scientist. He was wrong because he didn't have the tools to look deeper. In 1888, ground-penetrating radar didn't exist. Digging through a monolithic stone ceiling without knowing what was beneath it wasn't methodology, it was a gamble. Petrie drew a rational conclusion from the available data. The data simply turned out to be incomplete. De Cordier and his team presented the results at a public lecture at Ghent University in October 2008. The hall was full. The data was compelling. It seemed like the story of the Egyptian labyrinth was about to have a continuation. Instead, a few weeks later came an order to go silent. The Supreme Council of Antiquities of Egypt in 2008 was headed by Zahi Hawass, one of the most famous and simultaneously most controversial Egyptologists in the world, a man who knew how to turn archaeology into a spectacle, appearing on National Geographic covers, hosting television programs, opening tombs before cameras. But this public profile had a flip side. Hawass kept tight control over access to Egyptian monuments, and equally tight control over information about what was being found at them. The results of the Madaha expedition had been presented at the lecture in Ghent in October 2008. The data was published in the NRIAG journal. The Belgian press covered the discovery. It seemed the process had been set in motion. Official recognition, a permit for excavation, and international cooperation should follow. Instead, the Supreme Council of Antiquities banned the circulation of the expedition's results, citing national security concerns. De Cordier waited 2 years, until June 2010, hoping Egyptian authorities would make an official announcement themselves. It didn't happen. In 2010, he opened his own website, Labyrinth of Egypt, and released all the data publicly. It was the only way to tell the world what had been found. The official position of the Egyptian authorities came down to 2 arguments. The first, environmental. The high groundwater level around Hawara makes any excavation dangerous to the preservation of whatever lies underground. The second, methodological. Before excavation can begin, a complete 3-dimensional model of the underground structure must be created, and that requires additional surveys, which have not been permitted. Both arguments sound reasonable. The problem is that they are being applied not as conditions for beginning work, but as grounds for a complete ban on any further research whatsoever. In the 15 years since the Madaha expedition, Egyptian authorities have issued not a single permit for new scanning, not a single permit for test drilling, not a single permit to monitor the condition of the underground structures. The site is closed to researchers. The labyrinth lies untouched and deteriorates. Several independent teams that tried to gain access to Hawara after 2008 reported pressure from Egyptian authorities. According to available information, some of them signed non-disclosure agreements whose terms have not been revealed to this day. That in itself is unusual for academic research, where transparency is the standard, not the exception. Zahi Hawass left his post as head of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in 2011, in the midst of the Egyptian Revolution. But the policy toward Hawara did not change. His successors continued to maintain the same restrictions. What exactly lies behind this decision? Environmental caution, bureaucratic inertia, or something else? Remains an open question. Meanwhile, something underground is happening that doesn't wait for bureaucratic decisions. Saltwater is rising, and every year of delay costs the Labyrinth more than the year before. The Fayum Oasis is one of the most fertile regions of Egypt. Just a few miles from Hawara runs the Bar Wabi Canal, the irrigation artery feeding the farmland of the region. The canal is ancient, but its current configuration is the result of large-scale 20th century irrigation works that sharply increased the volume of water pumped into the soil. Nobody calculated the side effects of those works. Groundwater in the Hawara area began to rise. Today, saline groundwater has been detected at depths of just 13 to 16 feet below the surface. The labyrinth begins at 26 to 40 feet. The gap between the waterline and the upper boundary of the underground structures is narrowing every year. Once the water reaches the walls, slow but irreversible destruction begins. Salt crystallizes in the pores of stone, expands as it dries, and literally tears the rock apart from within. This is how stone monuments that survive thousands of years in dry conditions are destroyed in just a few centuries. The report by Dr. Abbas Muhammad Abbas, published following the Madaha expedition, flagged this threat directly. Saline waters, accelerated by modern irrigation and by the Aswan High Dam, which altered the hydrology of the entire Nile, are actively destroying both Amenemhat III's pyramid and the underground structures beside it. The pyramid entrance is already flooded. Petrie had struggled to get through the groundwater as far back as 1888, and the situation has only worsened since. But there is a paradox here that makes the situation particularly painful. The same water that is destroying the labyrinth is simultaneously the Egyptian authorities' main argument against excavation. The logic: beginning excavation under high groundwater conditions means flooding whatever you're trying to study. Any open chamber would immediately fill with water. Any artifact inside, papyrus, wall painting, wooden object, would be destroyed by contact with saline liquid within hours. This is a real problem. But it has a solution: drainage, pumping, creating a protective perimeter around the dig site. Expensive, technically complex, but achievable. Decordier and his colleagues repeatedly presented detailed drainage plans at conferences and in publications. The Egyptian authorities have not engaged with these proposals. The labyrinth has survived 3,000 years. It wasn't destroyed by conquerors, damaged by earthquakes, or burned by wars. It outlasted everything and lies underground untouched, waiting for people with sufficient persistence and sufficient technology to reach it. Those people exist. The technology exists. All that's missing is the permit. The data from the Madaha expedition, published by Decordier in 2010, contained more than just confirmation of the existence of underground structures. They provided a detailed enough picture of what exactly lay beneath the stone slab at Hawara, and that picture matched the descriptions of the ancient authors with striking precision. The ground-penetrating radar and electrical tomography detected, at a depth of 26 to 40 feet, a grid of vertical walls forming rectangular chambers. Walls several meters thick, anomalously massive even by Egyptian standards. Material with high electrical resistance, characteristic of granite or basalt. The structure covered several acres and was organized in a regular grid with clear axes and repeating proportions. Separately documented were vertical shafts descending considerably deeper than the main structure, in some readings, down to nearly 100 feet. This aligns with Herodotus' description of two levels of the labyrinth. The upper level he saw, and the lower level he wasn't permitted to enter. If the upper level corresponds to the structures at 26 to 40 feet, the lower lies even deeper, and it may be exactly where these shafts lead. Radar data doesn't allow individual rooms to be counted. The resolution is insufficient for that level of detail. But the overall scale of the structure and its regular organization don't contradict a single ancient description. A building of that size with that layout could well have contained precisely the 3,000 rooms Herodotus reported. The scanning revealed a closed perimeter surrounding the main structure, enclosing the entire complex from the outside. One research group described this outline as resembling the Egyptian Shen symbol, the sign of eternity, a closed loop with no beginning and no end. That is interpretation, not established fact, but it fits the logic of a building erected by a pharaoh still worshipped as a god 1,500 years after his death. The most important thing the data showed: the deeper levels of the structure remain dry. Groundwater has penetrated the upper layers, but has not reached the lower chambers. What lies deepest, what Herodotus was not allowed to see, has not yet been touched by water. But what exactly might be down there? And why do some researchers believe the contents of the lower chambers could change our understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization? Herodotus was one of the most meticulous observers of the ancient world. When he wrote that the lower halls of the labyrinth contained the bodies of pharaohs and sacred crocodiles, that's not a metaphor. That is what Egyptian priests told him, priests who went down there themselves. And if the lower chambers really do exist, and the radar data says they do, and if they are dry, then a question arises that is hard to dismiss. What has survived down there for 3,000 years in an enclosed space with no access to air or water? Egypt's dry climate is the best preservative in the world. It is exactly why papyri, wooden sarcophagi, and linen textiles lay in tombs for 3,000 years and reached us in a readable state. A sealed underground chamber in the Fayum is not ideal conditions, but close enough, especially if it is sealed by a monolithic stone ceiling that Petrie mistook for a foundation slab. Strabo wrote that the labyrinth was something like a stone library of the Egyptian state. Pliny mentioned hieroglyphs on the walls. If those inscriptions existed, and if the lower chambers have stayed dry, there may be text down there, not copies, not retellings, original documents from the Middle Kingdom era, written in the lifetimes of the people who built this building. For Egyptology, that would be a find without precedent. Most Egyptian texts have reached us as copies rewritten centuries after the original. Direct evidence from the 12th dynasty is rare. Studies of mortuary complexes from the Middle Kingdom show that such structures often contain not only religious texts, but state archives, lists of officials, land records, tax documents. Amenemhat III's labyrinth, given its scale and function as an administrative and religious center for the entire state, may have been exactly that kind of archive, the largest ever known. Herodotus was not allowed below. The priest explained it by the presence of sacred crocodiles and royal mummies. But the prohibition may have had another reason. The lower halls may have contained what the Egyptian priesthood considered too important for outside eyes, knowledge to which access was strictly limited, documents that were not meant to leave the walls of the labyrinth. We don't know what's there. Nobody knows, because nobody has been down there. And while saline water slowly rises and bureaucratic restrictions remain in force, that question stays unanswered. In 2023, Decordier was still trying to obtain permission to continue research at Hawara, 15 years after the Madaha expedition. 15 years of letters, requests, conferences, publications, and not one substantive response from Egyptian authorities. Meanwhile, the groundwater level kept rising. Why Egypt stays silent is a question with several answers, and all of them are true to varying degrees at the same time. The first, bureaucratic inertia. Egypt's monument management system is structured so that any non-standard decision requires sign-off at multiple levels. Authorizing a foreign team to excavate one of the country's largest potential monuments is a political decision, not an administrative one. Nobody wants to take responsibility for what might go wrong. The second, control over the narrative. Egypt has built an enormous tourist industry around a handful of key images: the pyramids, the Sphinx, Tutankhamun, Luxor, a discovery that potentially rewrites the significance of those monuments, or calls into question established interpretations of Egyptian history, creates uncomfortable questions that nobody needs. Not because the authorities are hiding something in any conspiratorial sense, but because managing the known is simpler than managing the unknown. The third, a real environmental problem. Groundwater in the Hawara area makes any excavation technically complex and expensive. Egypt has neither the budget nor the infrastructure for an operation of this scale on its own, and accepting foreign funding and foreign specialists means sharing control over whatever is found. Egyptian institutions are extremely reluctant to do that. All three reasons are real. None of them is sufficient justification for what is happening right now. Groundwater is already being detected at 13 to 16 feet deep, while the upper boundary of the underground structures begins at 26 feet. The gap is shrinking. The window for a full investigation without catastrophic losses is no longer measured in decades. It's measured in years. Mnemhat, the third's labyrinth, has stood for 3,000 years. Conquerors didn't destroy it, earthquakes didn't bring it down, wars didn't burn it. It survived everything and lies underground, untouched, waiting for people with enough persistence and enough technology to reach it. Those people exist. The technology exists. All that's missing is the permit. 2,500 years ago, Herodotus stood at the entrance to the lower halls and was not allowed in. Today we stand in exactly the same place. We have radar that sees through the earth. We have data confirming the existence of the structures. We understand the threat the groundwater represents. And we have the same answer Herodotus received. No. The difference is that Herodotus could walk away and write a book that people would read for 2,500 years. The labyrinth no longer has that kind of time.